together enough to not be scary in public, you know. And I'm standing there in line, waiting to go to the bank. I made the mistake of going at noon on a Friday. That was probably not the smartest move I ever made. And as I'm standing there in line, I hear behind me, "No, I'm not letting you have it. I'm not letting you have it. No, I'm not letting go." And I can figure out from the conversation, this is a woman with her little, 3, 4-year-old child, holding the child's hand and not letting go. And so I, of course, chuckled to myself, because I remember, all the, they're crying and wailing and hanging off your arm. You're like, "No, if I let go of you, you will go run across the parking lot. I know you will." Because they do. So I did it, and it went on for a little bit, and I just kind of smiled back, and the lady, the mom kind of smiled back, and I said, "Yeah, I was just remembering all of mine did that." And she laughed a little bit. We got to talking a little bit. Little guy started wiggling some more, trying to pull out. And she's like, "Buddy, I don't think this is going to happen." At which point, I reached into my pocket for my handy-dandy invitation card. But I got up to go to the bank, and my pocket was empty. So I get invited to the Easter egg hunt, but I didn't have a map, and I didn't have the dates written down, and I didn't have the convenient little card that shows her exactly what's going on. So it was nowhere near as effective as it could have been. And I was reminded, even in that moment, that I thought I was going to the bank to make a deposit, and then run and go get Laura a little flower at the Harris Teeter and everything, which I did do, which was fun. But what God was doing is God was setting a situation where this young lady would be in line behind me with her 2 friends that came with her, with children of their own, that I could have invited all of them in a very effective way to our Easter egg hunt. If I remembered that God is using my life in ways I don't always get to see. And that what I think is going on is not necessarily what's really happening in that time. Now, as we come to this passage of Scripture, it's kind of a rough one. We've been following David through his first days of establishing his kingdom. And we've already seen all kinds of things happen. We've seen battles get going on. We've talked about and wrapped this around the idea of when Jesus told us to love our enemies. And that is key. And that the establishment of David's kingdom is time after time after time after time him choosing to love his enemies instead of look out for himself. Most recently, last week, we talked about the betrayal of his friend and general Joab. That when peace had finally been achieved, when Abner, the general of Saul's son's forces, came to David, made peace with him, said, "You get to be king, I'll get everybody to follow you, Ishbosheth will bow to you, it will be done." Abner headed off to go take care of that, and then Joab killed him in an act of personal revenge for Abner having killed his younger brother Asahel in battle. And instead, Joab, David's general, murdered the man. And we talked about how our friends betray us. How our friends don't support us sometimes. How our friends sometimes do things that are in their own best interest, or in what they think is their best interest, counter to what we have. And we talked about that idea of maybe to forgive betrayal, even betrayal. Now we see the aftermath of what happens. And there are so many currents going on in David's reaction to the death of Abner. And it seemed to me that over and over within this, that theme, that idea, that things are not the way they look, keeps going around. Now we're in chapter 3 of the book of 2 Samuel, and we're starting in verse 28. Now this is right after Joab has killed Abner. It says, "Afterward, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are innocent before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May it fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's house. And may there not fail from the house of Joab one who has a discharge, or who is a leper, or who takes hold of the distaff, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread." So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner, because he had put their brother Asahel to death at the battle of Gibeon. Some of you remember that a while back, a couple chapters ago. We saw that where Asahel, the youngest brother of Joab and his middle brother, pursued the general Abner, chased after him everywhere on the battlefield. Abner asked him multiple times, "Would you please go away? You cannot win this fight." Abner, a tried general, a tried fighter, he knew he would win. Asahel, a young man whose claim to fame was that he ran fast. And he ended up killing Asahel while trying only to render him unconscious or unable to fight. As a result of that, we have this murder. Goes on, verse 31. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes and gird on sackcloth and lament before Abner." And King David walked behind the bier. Bier meaning the funeral, the casket. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. Then the king chanted a lament for Abner and said, "Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put in fetters. As one who falls before the wicked, you have fallen." And all the people wept before him. Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was still day. But David vowed, saying, "May God do so to me and more also, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun goes down." Now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, just as everything the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the will of the king to put Abner the son of Ner to death. Then the king said to his servants, "Do you not know that a prince and a great man have fallen this day in Israel? I am weak today, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too difficult for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil." Now, the reason that we all got a little lost, except me, and I almost got a little lost, is this passage is full of what we call cultural distance. The idea is that so many of the actions of David and the people around him are not the way we behave today. If I went up to a funeral and I ripped my clothes, they would call the police. Okay? But at that time, that was the way that you showed that you were in mourning, that you were genuinely affected by the death of the person who died. You tore your clothes. It talks about putting on sackcloth. We might interpret that as sometimes when people are in mourning, they'll wear all black, or they'll wear a black armband. That was kind of more earlier than our current day, or like in NFL teams where they will go ahead and wear a black ribbon, or within the police department where they'll put a piece of black tape over a badge. And the idea there is that this is the way that they would show mourning. They would dress up in sackcloth, in the kind of uncomfortable cloth that you would make a sack out of. And these were ways of showing that they were mourning Abner's death. The thing about it is, as David does this, the people are all looking at it. Because what does it look like? I mean, it looks like David lured the enemy general into his camp so his own general could kill him so that he'd be able to win the war. I mean, that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like to the people around. You remember at the end of it talks about then the people believed it wasn't the will of the king? When it happened, his own people believed, you know what? David is a slick guy. He arranged all of this. He put all this together. He made sure Joab was gone, and then came back at the right time, and he's the one who set this up. They thought that David was establishing his kingdom on this deceit and treachery. And they weren't necessarily that upset about it. He goes on, and also when he curses Joab, the things that he curses him with, most of them don't make sense to us. It talks about one who spins the distaff. And what he's really saying there is he's cursing Joab's family and saying, may there always be somebody who's got some kind of a running sore. Somebody who's got a skin disease. Somebody who can't hold a job and therefore ends up doing nothing that's meaningful. And what he's doing is he's going ahead and he's saying, look, God, and all of these were things that were considered to be part of God's curses for murder, God's curses for killing another human being. And what David is doing is he is pronouncing those curses on Joab as a murderer. He is denying that it was a justifiable homicide. He's denying that it was a righteous revenge killing, which, as we mentioned last time, was part of the culture of that time. Okay, that was part of the way they did justice then. And so what David is saying is he is calling Joab a murderer in a way that the people around him understand that. Then it goes on, and it says, everybody tear your clothes, they walk behind his casket, we still kind of keep that. And then, he doesn't just do that, but he sings a song for Abner. Now, if we think about this, this means that David, initially, when Saul and Jonathan died, he composed a song in their honor, and to teach this to all the people of Israel, praising his dead enemy, King Saul, as someone who was powerful and who was righteous and who followed God. Now here he is praising this next person, the very individual who dashed David's hopes in the beginning of chapter 2. The very person who, when David said, aha, I get to be king now because God's anointed is dead, and everybody knows that Samuel anointed me to be the next king. Well, Abner is the very person who grabbed Saul's youngest son and set him up as a king on the basis of his own power. So, if there's anyone that David would have treated as an enemy, if there's anyone that David might have legitimately hated and been angry with, it is Abner. And here he is, Abner is dead, and David is composing another song. Composing a song of honor. That Abner wasn't a fool. That Abner wasn't ridiculous. That Abner wasn't evil. But instead that wicked and evil men were the ones who killed him. Once again, laying that blame on his own general, saying there's no legitimacy in this killing. David goes on from there, he chants that lament, and then it says he didn't eat anything all day. Now, frankly, we don't believe in not eating anything all day, do we? The only time, how many of you in the last, no, I shouldn't say that. Most of us, the only time we don't eat something is when we have to go to the doctor for a test. That's pretty much it. Other than that, we're not going to be skipping a meal. Alright? So, that's the way it is. That's the way we do things here. One of the ways that people showed their mourning at that time is they would fast. Now, what I find funny is that when we look to the Old Testament and we look to the New Testament when it talks about fasting, it almost always is talking about you don't eat anything while the sun is up. And then a lot of times the practice seemed to be very much like the Muslim practice at Ramadan. You know, they got that whole month where they don't eat or drink at all while the sun is up. Now understand that you get up before the sun comes up and you have an hour-long banquet. And when the sun goes down, you know, you've got the youngest kid looking up out the sky. Wait for it. Wait for it. It's below the horizon. Okay. And then they have another big feast. So it's not like anybody's missing calories. But that's the way fasting worked in the Old Testament. Somehow now we seem to think that that means all day long and all kinds of stuff like that. We get a hold of our Greek clock with the 24 hours on it and go, oh, that's what's supposed to be. Well, but anyway, that's a side note. But the issue is that David is, once again, he's doing something that fits with the culture, saying, I am mourning for this. I am weeping for this. This is not my will. This is not what I wanted to have happen. And he is fasting for Abner. And throughout the day, the people press him and say, you ought to eat something. You really ought to eat something. You know, David, you've been through a rough time. It's been very traumatic for you. You just go ahead and have a little something to eat. And David refuses. He refuses because he's actually mourning. He refuses because he actually had nothing to do with it. He refuses because he's truly upset about what happened. And it's only when David goes to this extreme and fulfills this last piece of mourning for Abner that the people finally believe it. And they believe that he had nothing to do with Abner's death. Then David goes on. And I find this really interesting. And it says, all the people, they understood that day. And then the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? So once again, the person who could most readily be identified as his enemy, the person who has done the most to destroy David's claim to be king and tried to defeat him, the person who brought in an attacking force which precipitated that battle that we talked about, that individual, that David goes, that was a great man, a wise man in Israel. That was someone who was worthy of respect. And then he says, but I am weak, for these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. And he's talking about the brothers, Joab and Asahel. See, they're his nephews. And part of what they've done, and this is where we get into everything is not what it seems, okay? First of all, to all the people around them, it looks like David has had Abner killed so that he can win the war. But the truth is, David had nothing to do with it, and in fact, a peace had been concluded, and the war was over before Abner died. His death, instead, keeps it going. It goes on. Not only does it seem like he's the one who does that, but it would seem that Joab, David's faithful general, who has been able to lead his forces, who has stood by David all through Saul chasing him, all through serving the Philistines, all through losing his own family and then finding them again at Ziklag, and all of the different things that David has been through, that this man who's been his friend through thick and thin would continue to look out for David's best interests and not his own. And yet Joab, instead of being the general and the friend and the long-looking one who's looking out for the future of Israel, bets it all on personal revenge and gives it all away. And this one who it would seem would have been faithful and trustworthy turns out to be untrustworthy, and he turns against David. Not only is that the case, but you would think that now that David is king, now that he's established his innocence, that he would be able to bring punishment on Joab. That he would be able to bring down the law. He's the king. He has the power. But Joab has put himself in a place where, based on the technicalities, he cannot be stopped. Because you see, Joab killed Abner in revenge for the death of his brother. Well, the law does not specifically state that a death in war is not viable for revenge. And so Abner can say, no, he still killed my little brother. Yeah, it was wartime, but that doesn't necessarily mean it ought to be excluded. We talked last time about him killing Abner at the edges of a city of refuge where you're supposed to be able to run for that and then have your case tried. But it says that Joab killed him in the gates, not of Hebron itself, but of a little city right near Hebron. So that Joab could say, well, no, he wasn't really in the city of refuge. He wasn't quite there. I met him over here, so he didn't make it there. So he didn't have a right to that trial by the elders. Yeah, I was doing the right thing, taking that revenge. And Joab holds power. He is David's general, and the men are loyal to him. And David does not know how much of his army will stick around if he puts Joab to death for murder. You see, Joab has cleverly arranged the case where he can't be brought to task. Where David can curse him as a murderer, can call him a murderer, and yet because of the technicalities involved, cannot bring him to justice. You would seem that the king would be able to execute his justice as he sees fit, but here he cannot, without being unjust in the cases to come. That though Joab has abused the law in his favor, David knows that simply breaking it will open the door to innocent people being harmed in the future. Everything in this story, what it looks like on the surface, is not what's really going on. What it looks like on the surface is not what's actually happening. And so often in our life, in the situations where we find ourselves at odds with another human being, what's actually going on under the surface, what's actually going on in their heart, what's actually going on in their mind is often so different from what we perceive, from what we see. That what we take as malicious is meant to be helpful. Maybe it's poorly executed, poorly spoken, but it's meant to be helpful. That what we take as a slam against us is meant to be, in some odd way, a compliment from them. That because we lack the ability to stare into the heart of another human being, because we lack the ability to fully read what's going on inside someone else, exactly in everything of what they mean, then that puts us in that place that if we are going to love our enemies, the first piece of that is to give people the benefit of the doubt when we want to call them our enemies. To give people the benefit of the doubt when it seems like they are acting against us. When it seems like they are opposing us. When it seems like they are oppressing us. When it seems like they mean to hurt us. And to stop and to wait. And to take that moment in our heart, in our mind, and step back and say, maybe that's not what it is. And to give that consideration and thought. To take that moment to ask a question about what they meant. To take that moment to analyze and say, you know what, was this meant as fighting words, or is this just a comment or a question? Is it hostile, or is it puzzlement? Now, I'm not saying that every angry encounter is a misunderstanding. We all know better than that. And I'm not saying that every person who opposes us really thinks they're doing the right thing and is trying to be kind and coming off wrong, because that's not true either. We know sometimes real people really are malicious. And the reason we know that is sometimes we are malicious. We know that sometimes people do mean to hurt us with their words, because we know that we have said things and meant to hurt someone with our words. We know that. But what I'm saying is that as we look through Scripture and we see the situation that's going on, and we analyze it, we look at it in light of what Christ tells us about loving our enemies, that part of what we need to do and we need to understand as we follow through in our lives is that we are prone to seeing the surface and missing the truth. We are prone to seeing the offense and missing the love. That we are prone in who we are and what we do to search for the negative and not the positive. And to hear that so much more clearly. And so my encouragement to you this day, my encouragement to you for the rest of this week, is that in those moments when you are ready to lose your temper, to blow your top, to mutter under your breath at someone, to get truly angry with someone, to take a moment to look to the Lord and say, God, is this really what's going on? God, give me the strength to love my enemy enough to believe they might not mean all they seem to mean. And I'm not saying that that means everything will work out peachy fine. I'm not saying that that means that you'll see all the places where it's a misunderstanding and truth will come raining at you. I'm saying that when you turn that moment over to God, He will give you the insight to understand how it could be something other than what you're thinking. And He will give you the strength to respond appropriately in it, even if there truly is malice and anger and a desire to harm. So that's what I'm asking you to do this week. To not be like everyone else, to not be like the people of Israel, assuming they know the story because they see the surface. But in those moments, to go to God and ask Him to strengthen and enlighten your heart so that you can love your enemy instead of just believing the worst of them and fighting back. At this point, we're going to take a time to sing a hymn of decision. It's an opportunity, if you want to come forward to talk with me or pray with me, I'll turn off my microphone so it'll be just us. If God has let you know that this church home is where you belong, then please come forward and let me know. We can talk about what's involved in our new members class and in joining the church. And if there's something else God has put on your heart, maybe it was something from the beginning of the service, maybe it was one of the names that I read, and you went, wow, that made me think of this, and then hot wings, and then something else, but God was using that because He wanted to bring something to your mind. Say yes to God this morning so you can start on following Him about whatever He's revealed to you. Let's stand and sing.